Muito bom dia a todos. Estamos iniciando agora a nossa conferência. Em nome da Confederação Brasileira das Associações Comerciais e Empresariais do Brasil, quero registrar o nosso agradecimento em nome dessa comissão que foi formada, pensando o que a gente pode fazer e agregar para o futuro da mediação e bem como a utilização no Brasil. Aqui eu quero cumprimentar meus pares aqui de organização, o Marcelo, a Camille, a Fernanda, os nossos palestrantes que serão anunciados pelo Marcelo. Também não posso deixar de agradecer os nossos apoiadores, a Confederação Nacional dos Jovens Empresários, o Conselho Nacional das Mulheres Empreendedoras, os nossos projetos Empreender e Transformar, o Sistema Brasileiro de Apoio à Micro e Pequena Empresa, o SEBRAE, a quem a gente tem uma longa parceria no desenvolvimento de políticas públicas de acesso à justiça no Brasil, ao CONIMA, a nossa entidade que congrega câmaras de mediação e arbitragem e agora, recentemente, profissionais também que atuam nesses segmentos. E é uma honra também fazer parte dessa família CONIMA, o ICFML e a nossa empresa parceira, a WebCia, que estará aqui colaborando conosco na transmissão desse evento. Falar sobre mediação para nós é uma grande satisfação por entender que o Brasil hoje, no estágio que se encontra, já tem uma série de políticas. E o nosso papel enquanto sistema associativo, o sistema mais antigo deste país, que congrega mais de 2.000 associações comerciais espalhadas no mundo, ou no Brasil, é um dever nosso levar esse instituto para que as empresas adotem como política interna também. Estamos vendo agora uma crise mundial em função da pandemia e no Brasil não é diferente. Estamos preocupados, muito preocupados com os conflitos que surgem e que surgirão, principalmente em função do estágio em que vivemos. Então, eu espero que esta conferência seja também mais um marco para que a gente consiga pensar em soluções criativas, e bem como a utilização de todo o potencial que a mediação pode trazer na resolução, e não só na resolução, mas também na prevenção de disputas empresariais. Com as palavras iniciais, eu dou boas-vindas a todos e passo imediatamente a palavra para a nossa querida Fernanda Levi.
Obrigada, Eduardo. Bom dia a todos. É uma alegria estar aqui nessa manhã, né, falando de um tema fundamental. Quero cumprimentar, né, os meus colegas aqui, meus parceiros dessa jornada, Eduardo, Marcelo e Camille, dar as boas-vindas ao Giuseppe, Camilo e Ellen. Sejam bem-vindos ao Brasil, né, ainda que seja pelas telinhas aqui, que nós possamos estar juntos aqui em breve. E saudar também todos os que estão nos acompanhando nessa manhã e aqueles que nos acompanharão em outros momentos, né? Em nome do CONIMA, eu queria dizer da nossa honra e da nossa alegria em apoiar esse evento. O CONIMA é uma instituição que há mais de 20 anos trabalha pelo fomento das boas práticas dos meios privados de solução de controvérsias. É uma instituição com amplitude nacional, que contempla multidisciplinariedade, uma riqueza enorme de conhecimento, de esforços, de saberes em prol do desenvolvimento sustentável e sério e ético dos meios privados de solução de controvérsias, especialmente aqui na mediação. E como mediadora, eu quero reconhecer, né, os inúmeros esforços de muitas pessoas, de muitas instituições, de pessoas que há mais de 30 anos, né, transitam por este país e fora deste país, desenvolvendo a mediação nacionalmente. Nós temos um belo time, né? Um time companheiro, um time que não mede esforços, e hoje nós podemos dizer que nós temos mediação no Brasil, que nós temos excelentes mediadores brasileiros, né? Que nós temos caminhado por vários marcos de políticas públicas, nossa legislação, e acho, né, conversando com o Marcelo, que há muito tempo fala sobre esse assunto, e Marcelo é o grande, né, mentor deste evento, certamente, né? Nós estamos num momento importante, né? Nós estamos, talvez, no momento mais importante da nossa história, né, em termos de desenvolvimento dessas boas práticas. Nós estamos prontos, né? Prontos para trocar experiências, prontos para escutar, prontos para levarmos também a nossa riqueza das nossas práticas num país continental com tantas possibilidades. Então, é com essas palavras que eu agradeço muito, muito mesmo a oportunidade de compor esse time, de estar aqui nessa manhã memorável, né, há muito esperada, uma primeira manhã de muitas outras, certamente, de muitos outros dias. Então, é com essas palavras que eu agradeço, desejo a todos um excelente evento e passo a palavra para a nossa querida Camilo. Obrigada.
Obrigada, Fernanda. É realmente uma satisfação enorme estarmos aqui hoje, nessa manhã, e, ao longo do tempo, perenizados aí por poder disponibilizar isso para todos que quiserem estar conosco ao longo do tempo. Realmente, hoje, um evento, um marco, podermos ouvir, né, os super experientes Camilo, Ellen e Giuseppe, uma honra enorme aprender com as experiências que funcionam internacionalmente, poder, como a Fernanda falou, estamos prontos, o Brasil está pronto, já temos experiência, já temos trajetória, e na parte dos advogados, eu como advogada vejo há tantos anos os advogados também construindo novas formas de resolver conflitos, se aproximando dos interesses dos seus clientes, entendendo o conflito para além da resposta do judiciário apenas e ampliando a sua visão a partir do multiportas, a partir de tantas outras formas mais eficientes, e a mediação entrando como uma forma excelente em termos de eficiência jurídica para advogados e clientes. Então, também, juntos, Marcelo e Fernanda fundamos, há alguns anos atrás, o Meeting de Negociação, né, justamente para trazer para os jovens estudantes de direito, né, Eduardo apoiador desde o início também, com a CACB, com a CBMAE, e trazermos justamente para a graduação, que são os construtores do nosso futuro, né? Então, esses jovens poderem aprender na base técnicas, habilidades, ferramentas de negociação que vão lhes capacitar para depois serem extremamente eficientes nas mediações, né? Então, realmente, hoje é um marco muito potente, é uma satisfação enorme estarmos juntos aí neste momento, podendo ouvir experiências e construirmos juntos esse caminho de sucesso para um país muito promissor, como sempre, o nosso grande Brasil, e os brasileiros, né, resilientes, criativos, que têm total relação com a mediação. Então, sem mais delongas, agradeço muito a participação e passo a palavra para o nosso grande mestre Marcelo.
Obrigado, Camille. Obrigado, Fernanda. Um agradecimento muito especial para o Eduardo. O Eduardo, outro dia a gente conversava, a gente estava tentando lembrar quando a gente começa nessas estradas, né, Eduardo? Há tanto tempo que daqui a pouco a gente nem lembra. E pelo menos uns 17 anos incansáveis que o Eduardo trabalha sem parar, com muita determinação, com muita força, com muita energia, com muita alegria, para desenvolver dentro e fora da área dele de atuação a mediação, os métodos consensuais de resolução de disputas no Brasil. Então, Eduardo, é realmente uma honra estar com você aqui hoje, né? Especificamente faço menção à sua pessoa, à sua força, à sua energia, né, à sua determinação. É realmente muito gratificante poder ter na estrada, né, dessa nossa vida pessoas como você para que a gente possa juntos trabalhar e desenvolver, fazendo o nosso melhor. Eu fiz aqui uma anotação dos meus improvisos, né, vamos dizer assim, porque a gente precisa caminhar de uma maneira produtiva aqui, e eu gostaria de pegar emprestado uma frase do Victor Hugo, que diz que nada mais poderoso do que uma ideia cujo tempo chegou. Por que eu trago essa frase? Porque em 2013, o Giuseppe estava com a gente aqui no Brasil, no primeiro congresso de mediação judicial organizado pelo Conselho Nacional de Justiça, e o Giuseppe, naquela época, já falava sobre, já trazia a ideia, a perspectiva do que estava acontecendo na Itália, estava acontecendo na Europa, e como uma perspectiva para que a gente pudesse pensar também aqui no Brasil. Eu sei que aquelas sementes caíram em solo fértil, porém, tem um momento da semente também ganhar força, criar raízes, e agora, mais do que nunca, a gente tem um momento que o Brasil atravessa, né, uma discussão mais madura sobre esse tema. Então, Giuseppe, saiba que as sementes que caíram estão agora começando a dar frutos, e isso é fundamental. Eu queria fazer menção aqui também ao professor Asdrubal Júnior, que é diretor técnico da CBMAE, da Câmara Brasileira de Mediação e Arbitragem, né, Empresarial, porque o Asdrubal sempre ajudou a pensar como essa ideia poderia ser construída e trabalhada no Brasil, como desenvolver a nossa capacidade de aumentar o uso da mediação aqui no país. Então, Asdrubal está conosco o tempo todo, e eu faço questão de fazer essa menção aqui. Quero agradecer também as tradutoras, né, o Paulo e a Carolina, que estarão conosco hoje fazendo a tradução. Lembrar que existe a tradução simultânea, portanto, no botão de tradução aqui no Zoom vocês podem utilizar, né, e fazer as trocas que preferirem, do inglês para o português, do português para o inglês. Fazer um agradecimento muito especial aos nossos palestrantes, Giuseppe, Camilo, Ellen, né, a sensibilidade e a coragem de vocês para fazerem a mediação acontecer nos seus contextos, servem de inspiração para que a gente possa fazer o mesmo nos nossos ambientes. Obrigado de coração por vocês terem aceito o convite que nós fizemos para vocês. Ellen, desculpa a gente ter tomado o seu tempo, né, de férias, seu precioso tempo das suas férias, né? Obrigado por você dividir esse momento aqui conosco, de coração. Camilo, eu juro mesmo que eu torci para a Colômbia ganhar da Argentina na terça-feira passada, para que a gente pudesse ter uma final Brasil e Colômbia amanhã, mas por um capricho do destino, né, acabou que não deu, mas eu realmente estava lá torcendo fortemente para a Colômbia passar e a gente poder fazer um bom espetáculo amanhã, né, aqui na final da Copa América. Eu acho que a mediação ela nos proporciona encontros fantásticos, né? Fernanda, Camilo, tantas pessoas que estão aqui conosco, né, hoje, que a gente pode dividir. E eu diria que também um deles foi conhecer um irmão de caminhada. As pessoas já me mandam mensagens aqui no WhatsApp dizendo: mas vocês continuam muito parecidos, né? Vocês dois irmãos aí. E Giuseppe, eu realmente fico muito feliz de ter, né, nossas estradas se cruzado e tantas ideias que a gente conversa e tantos caminhos que a gente pensa juntos, né? E hoje é uma convergência muito importante desse nosso percurso. Eu realmente espero que os ventos do Mediterrâneo tenham renovado as suas energias e de todos os integrantes da sua linda família. E antes de te apresentar e apresentar Camilo e também Ellen, eu quero passar algumas instruções, alguns recados importantes. Nós vamos ter 1 hora, então, de apresentação, dividida entre os palestrantes. Em seguida, nós faremos um percurso de interação com os participantes, respondendo perguntas e comentando possíveis reflexões que vão ser colocadas aqui. As perguntas devem ser colocadas, então, no recurso Perguntas e Respostas, né, do Zoom, que está sinalizado na parte inferior do painel com um Q e um A, né, de Questions and Answers, né, o Q&A. E eu peço, então, que vocês utilizem prioritariamente esse recurso para que a gente possa recolher aqui as perguntas, as dúvidas, e depois a gente fazer a interação ao final. O outro pedido é para que a gente possa se conhecer melhor. Vocês já estão colocando aqui no chat, mas se vocês quiserem, fiquem à vontade para colocar o nome de vocês, a qualificação ou o que você faz, né, e a cidade de onde você está participando. Então, agora eu apresento um brevíssimo currículo dos nossos palestrantes. Giuseppe de Paula é um ombudsman para fundos e programas das Nações Unidas. Sua equipe está baseada na cidade de Nova York. Tem a tarefa de ajudar e prevenir, né, resolver disputas relacionadas ao trabalho dentro do PNUD, Unicef, o UNFPA, o NOPS e ONU Women. Durante a sua carreira, o Sr. De Paulo ele contribuiu para a resolução de mais de 2.500 disputas, mediando casos em mais de 60 países e lidando com partes de mais de 90 nacionalidades diferentes. Antes de integrar, né, e ingressar na ONU, o Sr. De Paulo foi presidente do conselho do ADR Center, um dos maiores provedores de serviços de mediação na Europa. Ao mesmo tempo, ele atuou como diretor do GEMS International, uma subsidiária da GEMS, né, o maior provedor privado de serviços de resolução alternativa de disputas do mundo. O Sr. De Paulo iniciou sua carreira acadêmica em 1995 e, em 2002, tornou-se professor internacional de resolução alternativa de litígios e prática na Mitchell Hamline School of Law, onde ministrou cursos de negociação, negociação avançada e negociação intercultural. Entre 2004 e 2015, ele serviu para algumas das maiores organizações doadoras internacionais, como diretor de projeto em uma ampla gama de iniciativas para promover o conhecimento e o uso de mediação e arbitragem em todo o mundo. O Sr. De Paulo prestou consultoria especializada aos parlamentos nacionais e supranacionais, bem como aconselhou os ministros da Justiça e da Economia de vários países sobre políticas de resolução de disputas. Ele escreveu extensivamente sobre mediação e algumas de suas publicações foram traduzidas para vários idiomas. A Ellen Connors é secretária de mediação do Banco Interamericano de Desenvolvimento, onde administra o programa de mediação do BID e realiza mediações para conflitos no local de trabalho e queixas relacionadas ao emprego. O programa de mediação do BID foi estabelecido em 2013 como parte de uma reforma abrangente do sistema integrado de ética e resolução de conflitos do BID, e desde então tem sido altamente eficaz na resolução de disputas internas antes do litígio. A senhora Connors tem formação em Direito e Economia e começou sua carreira no BID em assuntos jurídicos corporativos, depois trabalhando em cargos em estratégia e eficácia no desenvolvimento e no escritório de ética, antes de assumir o seu cargo atual como secretária de mediação em 2018. Secretária de mediação do BID. Camilo Azcarate é um especialista em resolução de disputas internacionais, com 25 anos de experiência como mediador, ombudsman, facilitador e instrutor, trabalhando para organizações públicas, privadas e internacionais. Ele é o atual provedor de justiça no Observatório Europeu do Sul, e anteriormente ele gerenciou o escritório de serviços de mediação para o grupo do Banco Mundial e foi o ombudsperson geral na Universidade de Princeton. Camilo ministra cursos de pós-graduação na Universidade de Colômbia e foi fellow no Whitehead Center para Assuntos Internacionais da Universidade de Harvard no ano de 2018. Então, nós temos a honra e a felicidade de poder dividir, né, as nossas experiências com as experiências desses nossos queridos palestrantes. E assim, eu passo a palavra, então, para o meu querido amigo e irmão Giuseppe de Paula.
Muito obrigado a todos os organizadores por me convidarem para essa conferência. Prometia a meus amigos Eduardo, Fernanda e Camilo e a meu irmão no Brasil, Marcelo, que falaria em português hoje. Infelizmente, terá que ser da próxima vez. Prometo que se o CACB organizar um evento semelhante no futuro, talvez pessoalmente, então estarei pronto para falar em português, ou melhor, falar em brasileiro. So that's it for the time being. I promise I will do better next time. I am very happy to be here, and these are not words of circumstances. I've done, like all of you, so much till we can be together, as Fernanda mentioned, but to hear the music, to see everybody cheering through the chat, bom dia, that really made my heart smile. We have a very rich program, so as much as I would like to say nice things to you, I believe it's time for me to approach the subject matter that was given to me. And I will start right in the middle of our topic, Mediando a Mediação. I hope it's working. It's not working here. Give me a second. I don't know why this is not going. Can you see the screen? Can you see what I'm showing?
Not now.
Okay, let me try one more.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I should be able to do it. I wasn't able to move it, right? I was sharing. Please. No. Can you see the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if you see the question, all right. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, the question that I'd like to ask might sound weird to some of you, and is, do we need more mediations? Perhaps 100% of the participants in this conference will say, of course, right? But if you think about it, this is a good question to ask, because for how many years in the United States, in Brazil, in Europe, have we been speaking about mediation? So one thing that I want to say, for sure, it would be hard today to say that people are not aware of mediation, right? For today's talk, I'm going to assume that yes, it is a societal and individual goal. I mean, it's a goal for us as individuals and for society at large to have more mediations than we do now. Not to have only mediations, but more mediations than trial, for example. My colleague Camilo Azcarate is responsible for writing this slide, and what I liked about it is how he put it. Yes, the answer is that we do need more mediations, because several years, tens of years of nicely, properly managed mediation programs have shown the benefits of mediation, both as a common good in terms of the consequences on the justice system, less burden, faster, the budget that has to be paid, to finance the judicial system, but also as individual goods, right? Something positive for us individually. Think about the high level of satisfaction. Think about the high level of compliance, right? So we are going to go deeper on this, but I just wanted to make sure that we do not lose sight that the question is proper. Why is it that we as human beings, especially in countries where I know there are so many colleagues, so many highly sophisticated colleagues, so many programs through LinkedIn I see all the time, we need to ask ourselves this particular question right here. In fact, what I'm trying to talk about is what I call the global mediation paradox. And that means that maybe in certain countries, at least, we have more mediators than we have more mediations, right? Some people think, as I was mentioning, that that is an issue of falta de cultura. No? People don't know about it. I don't think we can make this claim after many decades of teaching, doing conferences, certification programs, and even having legislation about this. To me, knowledge is important, but it is not the number one question, number one issue. Now, let's stick with the title. The title is Mediating Mediation. What does it mean? Well, I think that essentially we know what the problem is. There are many theories, many models, but essentially it can be boiled down to two. We have, on the one hand, a mediation which is fundamentally voluntary, right? Legally, there is no problem to make mediation voluntary, right? However, the problem with voluntary mediation anywhere in the world is that the numbers of mediations, when mediation is only voluntary, people can freely decide whether or not to mediate. The number are very low, sometimes are extremely low. So we have more mediators than mediations. The opposite model, just to simplify, if here is voluntary, we have a mandatory mediation. Mandatory mediation, of course, generates more cases, because if I have a dispute against my friend Eduardo, I must start a mediation. So that will make the number of mediations grow. However, mandatory has two issues. Number one, can be legally problematic. And number two, which is connected to number one, it places a very heavy burden on people, for example, who want to go to court directly. Well, we are mediation scholars, students, practitioners. I would like to say that the answer is pretty easy. In between these two things, in between these two models, there is a mediated outcome, a mediation solution that is legally safe. It can be done, has no legal consequences and limitations, and generates enough cases. I think that this mediation, this mediated outcome, is the convergence, is the product, the output of two things. And here's the mediation. And mediation brings about the idea of a dispute. We do have all over the world this legal concept that parties, litigants, cannot be forced to agree, of course, to find the solution to a legal dispute. I would go a little farther. Parties cannot be forced to go through mediation all the way through if they think it's a waste of time, okay? So parties cannot have too hard a life if they want to litigate. That is a universal legal principle. I don't think there is any country in the world where this is not true. Access to justice, and even access to courts, which is a different concept, but belongs in the same group. So this is principle number one. On the other hand, what we have is not the legal principle, it's a fact, it's evidence. Wherever mediation is fully voluntary, we have very few cases. So this is the dispute that we have. So the solution, which I don't think is particularly smart, particularly brilliant, is to create a model that combines the benefits of both mandatory and voluntary mediation. And there are many names. One name, one title that this model comes with is the mediation with easy opt-out. That is, I am obliged to make serious initial efforts, serious, reasonable initial efforts at mediation. But I am not obliged to continue with mediation if I do not like it, myself or my opponent. Of course, as you know, everybody can abandon mediation anytime, right? But if I am allowed to leave mediation before spending too much time and too much money, then leaving the mediation, opting out, is easy. That's That's the name. Let's look at one example, not the example, of how the model works, so you can understand what I have in mind. Let's assume again that I have a dispute against our friend Eduardo, okay? The easy opt-out model, this is, for example, the Italian version, but there is a version in Greece, there is a similar version in Turkey, in other countries as well. The way it works is that I, the plaintiff, the person who has suffered damages or has a claim, the plaintiff, before going to the judge, I will have to invite Eduardo to mediation. So you see the first part here in green, I file a mediation request, okay? Now, Eduardo received the mediation request from me. He has two options, right? He can accept, or he can deny, or maybe he doesn't even show up, he doesn't even answer me, okay? If Eduardo does not show up when I invite him, in the easy opt-out model, Eduardo, as the defendant, invited to mediation, and he says no, risks of paying a sanction, okay, if the judge, right, when the trial begins, because if there is no mediation, the trial begins, when the judge hears the case. Because what happens is that I, having filed my request of mediation, okay, with the mediation center, I have to go to a mediator, mediation center. That mediation center will give me a piece of paper saying, yes, Giuseppe invited Eduardo, but Eduardo did not show up. Or Eduardo responded, he would not participate. With that piece of paper, I get access to the judge and the trial begins. It's a regular trial, okay? This is the first hypothesis, that Eduardo does not want to participate at the initial, the first session, you know, accepting my invitation. If Eduardo accepts my invitation, as you can see, we're going to be together, the three of us, myself, Eduardo, and the mediator, and we have the initial mediation session, okay? What's very important is what happens during that meeting. If Eduardo comes, talks to me, listens to me and the mediator, and decides to stop mediation, he's going to face no sanction. He has fulfilled his duties under the law to show up and participate in this initial meeting, okay? So, of course, the mediator will say, yes, the two parties came, we had an initial mediation session, and the party decided to stop, okay? With that piece of paper, I can go to the judge and say, you know, judge, I tried. But the judge will not put a sanction on Eduardo because Eduardo did come to the meeting. To the contrary, if the three of us, myself, Eduardo, and the mediator, well, myself as the plaintiff, Eduardo as the defendant, decide to go on with the mediation, after the initial session, we'll have the second session or the third session, depending on our schedule, what we want, and an actual mediation will take place, okay? At the end of the mediation, as you can see, there could be a settlement, case is over, or it could be no settlement, mediation failed. So this is the concept, you know, imagine that you are going to a restaurant, right? And you don't know if you're going to like the lasagna, okay? But if you order the lasagna, you have to pay for the lasagna. So you tell the mesero, to the waiter, Mr. Mesero, give me just one bite, a little bit of lasagna, and I'll pay for that, okay? If I like the bite of lasagna, I'll buy the rest of the lasagna. So you can taste the mediation as the plaintiff, because during that initial meeting, you present your case, the mediator is there, and the other side is there. And the attitude of the other side, the willingness or not willingness to engage in a discussion, will allow both sides to decide, should we stay in this mediation? Should we continue after the initial meeting or not? Of course, if the parties do continue with the meeting, they pay more than that initial fee, right? So the smart idea of this model, I believe, is to make people only pay for that first bite, for tasting the quality of the process. Okay, we will see why this initial, not very costly session is very important from a legal point of view as well. Now, let's see what this model, and again, it's just an example, has done. I'm going to explain you what this slide does because it's most fascinating. I'm using Italy as a model because Italy changed 4 times the legal model over a period of a few years. So it's very important to see what was the number of mediations. Remember, we want more mediations that each type of legislation produced. When I speak about legislation, I mean model. Mediation started being legislated upon in Italy around 1992, so about almost 30 years ago. And until 2010, we had just 10,000 mediation per year, less than that. Very, very small numbers, okay? The law changed dramatically in 2011 when the first mediation law, mandatory mediation law was introduced. It was not the opt-out model. It was the first model, it was the second model, the fully mandatory model. You had to mediate and you had to pay everything, even if you didn't want to settle, okay? As you can see, in 2 years, the number of mediations went up significantly. And the success rate was amazingly high. 42% was the success rate. So people did not want to mediate. They mediated because they had to do it before going to the judge, right? And in 42% of the cases, they settled. At the end of 2012, as you may know, the Italian Constitutional Court ruled that this mediation model, mediação totalmente mandatória, was not constitutional. So mediation became fully voluntary again. So in 2013, it became the same as before 2010. The number of mediations dropped. We had some mediations, as you can see in the third column, 2013, because these were cases that had started before the court. Immediately after realizing what happened to mediation without the mandatory law, the government decided to make mediation happen again. But this time they were smarter. They thought of a model that would be, yes, mandatory, but not as heavy for the parties. So the easy opt-out model was introduced, and is the model that I showed you before. You file the request, and the defendant is obliged to participate only in the first meeting, okay? As you can see, the number of mediations, of course, is much higher than when mediation is voluntary, but it's also higher than when mediation is totally mandatory, right? Not only that, the success rate of mediation with easy opt-out is even higher. The factor of the success, okay? Parties like it more. So if you think about it, that first meeting, that initial session, act as a filter. The cases go through, and on that, during that meeting, you can see, you can try what cases are good for mediation, and they will continue, and what cases is good to stop right there. Now, if you look at the data, they are telling something very, very important. Of course, we know in Italy, there is no mediation required by the law. We have voluntary mediation, of course. If Eduardo and I decide to go to mediation, we can. There is no problem with that. Or Eduardo and I, if we are commercial parties, we can have mediation in the contract. No? He's a seller, I'm a buyer, we can put mediation there. And of course, like in many countries, the judges, when the case is already pending, can suggest or order mediation. But look at the percentages. Mediation has been in Italy, remember, since 2010, right? The new law. And yet, after 10 years, the vast majority of mediations remain the mandatory one. Mandatory, only the first meeting, remember, okay? Mandatory, only the first meeting. So anytime people try to increase the number of mediations, of course, the idea is to make it a requirement. And an argument which is often made is that for those who are against any form of mandatoriness, any legal requirement, they don't like that. They say you can lead the horse to water, but you cannot oblige the horse to drink. Well, if you look at this data, where people are, where horses are forced to the river, I think the answer is that the horses, if the water is good, they're likely to drink, because people do settle cases in mediation, and they do report satisfaction with the process. So I think from a policy point of view, the argument, if you lead the horse to water, the horse might not drink, doesn't make any sense, because the policy should not deal with one horse, one individual, one case. The policy should deal with all the horses, with all the litigants, with all the cases, and should be, or could be, as lead all your horses. I mean, make all cases go to mediation. And then count how many cases settle. That's a plus. How many cases do not settle? And that's a minus. And then you do the difference. Because any time, of course, a mediation is successful, there is a common good and an individual good. There is a saving. Anytime mediation fails, of course, there's a loss. But what are the numbers? Okay. Of course, and this is a big issue we don't have time for now, because I'm about to finish my time. Mediation has to be of very good quality. You don't want mediation to be bad. And how do you ensure that? Okay. I want to show one more thing, which is very important to you and to us. In the Italian system, and all the system where there is some requirement about mediation, the government keeps track of how many mediations are occurring. And mediation is not required. That initial meeting in Italy is only required in a small percentage of cases. Otherwise, we would have many more mediations in Italy. Okay, by and large, mediation is required, the initial first meeting, in about 12 to 15% of all the civil and commercial cases every year. One area where mediation is required, the initial meeting, is real estate, for example. And as you can see, the number of real estate cases after mediation became required in those cases has dropped dramatically. And this is the case for all the subject matters, like medical malpractice, for example, where mediation is required. Now, there has been a general drop in litigation in Italy, maybe because of the economic crisis, but the drop, the less cases in the areas where mediation is required, is much higher. That could be two things. One, a coincidence, but I don't believe in those. I believe is evidence that people do not file cases because by filing mediations before they go to trial, remember, in the Italian model, mediation takes place outside and before trial. Because the cases settle outside the courts, those cases do not appear in court. Can this be done? I don't know much about Brazil, but I can tell you that yes, this idea of requiring the initial meeting can absolutely be done in Europe. What I'm showing you now is a decision, the first decision of the Court of Justice of the European Union on mediation in 2010. There have been other judgments, and you can see the full citation at the bottom, that have confirmed this principle. And I want to show you what the judges wrote. This is actually from the judgment. First of all, as you can see in the first paragraph, even the judges, the Avogado General, admits that if you want to have an effective alternative dispute resolution system, it cannot be voluntary. Read the first paragraph, okay? The second part is what is the guidance and what inspired the Italian model. And it basically says, you say underline, that yes, mediation can be made mandatory. It is legal to do it in the European Union, under European Union constitutional law, as long as four requirements. First, na conduz a uma decisão coletiva. It's not binding, and mediation is not binding. Eduardo and I can mediate, and we can disagree. Nobody's going to make a decision for us. So mediation does set aside the first requirement. Doesn't take too much time. Atraso substancial. It depends on what the law says. For example, the law in Italy speaks of 60-day maximum. So 60 days is considered to be not something that delays the process too much. So if the law says 60 days, 70 days, 80 days, presumably we satisfy also the second requirement. The third requirement is also, I think, universal. Every mediation law that I know says that if I start the mediation against Eduardo, the time we spend to mediate will not have an impact on my right to sue Eduardo if mediation fails. So this is plain vanilla. The fourth point is the key. The fourth says, in the European Union, mediation should be either free, zero cost, or do not cost that much. So the idea that you pay for the little amount for the mandatory meeting, initial meeting, right? And you pay more for mediation if you decide to continue, it's a smart idea, I believe, to reconcile the fact that mediators must be paid for a professional job, okay? But there are two moments, the mandatory moment where the fee, the amount that litigants have to pay is very small, remember, for the first bite. And then the fee becomes normal. Why? Because it's no longer problematic from a legal point of view, because the parties decide to continue. So that becomes a voluntary process. I'm sure you have a lot of questions and there's so much more to be said. So with my apologies for taking so much time, I'm available for questions at the end. It's time for me to give the word back to the Marcelo and the other speakers. Thank you for listening.
Obrigado, Giuseppe. Temos mais uma vez, e a cada vez que você nos traz essas reflexões, elas ficam mais claras, que ajudam a entender ao longo do tempo quais foram os pontos de aprendizado quando os modelos podem efetivamente serem implementados e nos dão essa ideia, o que precisa ser aperfeiçoado. Por isso, em algum momento é preciso começar, preciso ter a coragem de começar e depois desenvolver e aperfeiçoar o modelo. Muito obrigado pelas interessantes, instigadoras e muito objetivas informações. Eu passo a palavra agora para o Camilo Azcarate, realizando as suas complementações e nos trazendo também o seu percurso, a sua experiência e as suas percepções.
Thank you, Marcelo. And as you said, I am originally from Colombia. I was born there and I studied law there. Unfortunately, I do not follow soccer, football, so closely as probably an average Brazilian does. So that's probably a terrible scene in Brazil. But I started my path back in 1991 when I did my my law degree. I did a study about the mediation law when I graduated in 1991. And then in the mid-90s, I went to the United States to finish my education as a dispute resolution professional. And I remember back in the 90s, we used to talk about the new wave that was coming up of dispute resolution and how that was going to change so many things. Well, it didn't turn as a wave, more like a slow tide, slowly rising in the area of dispute resolution, including mediation and ombudsman. So we have had 30 years to learn a few things about what works and what doesn't work in the practice of dispute resolution. So this kind of trial and error has shown us some lessons learned that I'm going to share today. A lot of what I'm sharing today, by the way, I applied as the manager of mediation services at the World Bank for 10 years. I had the opportunity at the beginning of my tenure in that position to change the laws, the internal laws of mediation. And I used the opt-out model because I knew at that moment, even back 13 years ago, I knew that it was going to make a huge difference in the way that we provided this service within the World Bank. So some of the weaknesses, as have been mentioned before by Giuseppe, some of the systemic weaknesses that we have observed in mediation come from the fact that from the one side, there's weak demand, because the fact that even though mediation, of course, has to be voluntary when it comes to the settlement, and it has to remain as such. When we started selling mediation or talking about mediation to the world, I think that the model that we used was the opt-in model that we used, that was the most promoted in the United States. I think that model created weaknesses in the demand that we noticed. Many of us who actually trained mediators back in the 90s, I remember we used to tell our trainees that yes, we could train them in mediation, but getting a mediation was something totally different. It was going to be so much more difficult. And so we have to ask ourselves why. Why is it that the opt-in model, the model in which both parties have to agree to come into mediation, why is it that it doesn't work? And I have reflected for a very long time about this, for decades on this with colleagues. And I think that it is because there are barriers to this, to people coming into mediation. And that's why probably we have to give people the opportunity to taste, like Giuseppe said, the lasagna of mediation in order to overcome these barriers. And the fact is, we know from research that we tend to avoid conflict as an adaptive behavior, a behavior that comes from our biology. Running away from a person that we have conflict with is a very common strategy. It's actually, when I have been measuring conflict modes for decades now, and when I measure conflict modes, the most popular is always avoidance. Even among managers, people will try to avoid conflict. So mediation forces them to face the party they're having conflict with, which goes against this biological kind of instinct that we have. There are also cultural limitations. Some cultures that have high levels of power distance or high levels of uncertainty avoidance, meaning cultures in which authorities and non-authorities are separated psychologically and by a distance, if we can call it, or cultures in which not being sure about something creates a lot of stress. So uncertainty creates a lot of stress. And mediation produces this. It creates uncertainty. Unlike court procedures that look like they are very clear step-by-step process, a mediation opens up a question mark. And unfortunately, most of the Latin American cultures are both high in power distance and high in uncertainty avoidance. So culturally, we are in a situation in which we are going to resist just the idea of entering a process that is so uncertain. In particular, this is true, and I work mostly in workplace matters. In particular, this is true when you are having the conflict with a higher up, with your supervisor. Another limitation is structural. And this is a common misunderstanding that happens when people get introduced to mediation and they say, oh, it's going to be a great solution for a country because we have such a weak system, judicial system, either because it's slow, because sometimes matters of corruption, and then mediation is going to be our salvation. I remember listening to this in 2007 when I went to Nicaragua to train a few mediators, and I told them, I have bad news for you. If you have a weak judicial system, then at least one of the parties in each case has an interest in continuing in that system because they don't want, they want the situation to continue. They may be the person who is responding to the civil case, and the more time that it takes or the more corrupt that is the situation, the more they will benefit. So unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. It may work, as Giuseppe was saying, the other way around. If you have a strong mediation program, and I will explain how you can get that. If you have a strong mediation program, you may reinforce the judicial system, but it doesn't work the other way around. So the other side of the problem is that then a lot of legislations jump from the opt-in voluntary, 100% voluntary model into the mandatory mode. And I have also seen that failed, and it fails mainly because of the problems with the supply of mediation, and in particular because it's seen as just another step in the judicial process. It is not taken seriously or with professionalism, and unfortunately, low quality of the people who are providing the service, both in the administration and in the providing of the service themselves. By the way, I will talk a little bit about the administration of mediation programs because I administered for many years a mediation program. I was the manager of that program. I also, early in my career in the United States, managed a case with the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. So I was working for an agency of the state of Massachusetts that administered the mediation program for the Supreme Court. So the middle path that works. This is the what I consider the opt-out model. Is the process that will address the issues of a weak demand and also the issues of a weak offer. So as I won't go too much into this because Giuseppe already talked about this. So the opt-out model is a model in which the parties are asked to attend an intake and a first mediation session. And after that first session, they can opt out. They can go out of the process if they want. This can happen at different points of entry. Giuseppe said that in Italy, this happens before the case enters the judicial process. And that is also very common, and that's the way that is written, for instance, in the Colombian law of 1991. So it can be the request of one party, or it can be a contractual clause. And these are the two most common ways in which mediation starts before the process. It also, of course, can happen that you have a law like in Italy that forces the pre-judicial mediation process. It also can happen once the mediation process enters. And here I'm talking about my experience when I was working in the United States with this program of mediation in the Supreme Court of Massachusetts. So it was very common to have the judges send cases to mediation, refer them, that would be the correct word. And also it was a step in the process. It can be established as a step in the process. So these may be the points of entry. And it doesn't matter which point of entry you are. This model, like the other models, can be used in any of these points of entry. Why does it work? Why does mediation works? Well, it does overcome some of the psychological barriers that I was mentioning before. It tends to overcome the biological, the cultural, and the structural barriers that I mentioned. However, in order to overcome the structural barriers completely, it requires service providers that follow best administrative practices. And I'll get a little bit into that. So what if you are going to create either a mandatory or an opt-out model, meaning if you are asking the parties to a conflict to try mediation, I believe that you owe them something. And what you owe the parties is high quality from my perspective. So on the one side, you owe them administrative quality in the mediation programs. You need to have good intake processes. And intake is that session or that meeting that is individual with each of the parties, in which an administrator of the program explains how the process works, prepares them, etc. Now, as I said, in the program that I managed at the World Bank, I created a quality control step at the intake step. I said, if the administrator that is conducting the intake believes that the case is not good for mediation, they should be able to stop the mediation to move forward. Why did I do that? Because if you are making in some way mandatory, okay, like in the case of the mandatory mediation or the opt-out model, if you are asking people to come, you have to make sure that the people who are entering are doing it in good faith. And there is a very small minority of cases, I would say probably less than 5% of cases that we managed at the World Bank, in which even though there was a request for mediation, when we conducted the intake, we decided that it was not a good case and we had the power to stop the process from continuing. Again, it was an exceptional kind of a step, but we did it in approximately 5% of the cases. You also have to, as an administrator, to actively manage the process. What does it mean? It's not just a matter of referring the cases to the mediator and forgetting about it. A good administrator keeps tabs on, keeps control on the process. What is happening? Is the mediation going well, etc. And also, at the end of the process, the administration has to control the quality of through evaluations. And we conducted evaluations back then that in each one of the cases that people managed. So let's talk, this one is a little bit more common and well-known, the quality of the professionals themselves. So yes, we have to have training in best practices. We have to teach mediators how to conduct this. We also should have co-mediation step as part of the training program, and then observations of solo mediations with evaluation. This is the way that we selected our regional mediators at the World Bank. They have to perform a mock mediation, a mediation that was not real. It was kind of what we do in training, but they have to pass it. And we had several mediators taking notes and making observations. You also need to have a fast, responsive, and flexible provider of the services. You need to respond emails quickly. You need to schedule these mediations as fast as possible. So the professionalism of the service has to be there. So alternatives for administration of these programs that I have observed throughout my career in this field. The first one will be in-house. You may have independent programs that are part of the state, or in the case of the World Bank and Inter-American Development Bank, we're talking of part of the organization. So these programs can be within courts. One example, for instance, is the multi-door program in Washington, D.C. There are several of these as well in Massachusetts, in which you have a court that has several doors that people can enter. And one of them is the mediation door. And it is a very interesting program within that. Or you may have an agency that is a state agency that serves the courts. You may have also outsourced program, and this is, by the way, the most common way in which I have seen mediation working in the United States. The community mediation programs, many of them have developed relationships with the courts, and they have kind of a pipeline that goes from the courts and they get refer cases. We have something similar at the World Bank, where some of the grievance mechanisms that we had refer a case that entered them. They refer the cases for mediation to us. And finally, you have private organizations that actually provide these services and that can be connected either with the courts or can provide the service before the case goes to court. So the alternative for the actual mediation services can be in-house. Of course, the mediators are employees of the provider, or they can be outsourced or referred to an external mediator, which may be sometimes there are cases of voluntaries, like in the case of community mediation, but there's another very interesting example in the federal government of the US in which volunteers who are employees of agencies provide mediation services to employees of other federal agencies, and that is a volunteer program. Or, and this is my preference, having managed both volunteer and professional mediators, I am a big fan of professional mediators. Sometimes in this situation, you can control the quality so much better when you are dealing with professional mediators than not. And these professional mediators or voluntary can either be designated by the administrators of the program, or they can be selected by the parties. And I won't get into how the process for selecting it, but it was similar to the process that is followed sometimes to select arbitrators in arbitration programs. So let me go to the last point that summarizes this. What does not work well? Based on 30 years of experience in my case, and many more in the case of dispute resolution, the opt-in mediation program we know produces weak demand. We may end up, as Giuseppe said, we may end up with more mediators than mediation, and that is a tragedy. You know, it's very difficult to actually train hundreds of people and then having them not enough work to do. Mandatory mediations tend also to have weakness in the supply side. It's probably overdoing it. What works better? We know that the opt-in opt-out model, the model in which you invite people to come to the first session, they have to come to the first session and of mediation, and up to that point that they can walk away from it, it works better. We know from the Italy experience and in other places, and we know also from our experience in international organizations. And they need to be managed by in an independent manner. So you cannot give, for instance, the judge the power to mediate program and expect good results. This is the conclusion that I have. You have to have a well-managed independent program committed to providing services, and these services have to be provided by mediators that follow best practices. Hopefully, professional mediators or very good volunteer mediators. And also the final point here, which is something that I learned as an administrator of a program, is sometimes you, as an administrator, if you are assigning a case to a mediator, you have to find the right mediator for the right case. Some mediators are much better with, let's say, emotions than others. Others are more transactional. So you learn by observing the mediators what their style is, and you try to adapt that to their style, the case to the style of the mediator. And again, at the earliest possible point. So you create a system in which either the cases come before the tribunal, before the court case, or you create some kind of a pipeline that is as early as possible from the courts into the mediation program. So that is my presentation, and we can get questions and answers, and I'll turn now to Marcelo so that our colleague Ellen can finish the presentation. Thank you.
Obrigado, Camilo. Pontos fundamentais, muitas pessoas estão também perguntando se os materiais serão compartilhados, porque trazem aspectos fundamentais que devem ser observados na implementação desse tipo de modelo. E a resposta é sim, nós vamos encaminhar esses materiais, exatamente para que vocês possam ter uma síntese dos pontos fundamentais que foram abordados aqui, que são efetivamente o resultado de muita experiência e de observação do que funciona o que pode ajudar nas implementações. Sem dúvida, é uma responsabilidade muito grande quando nós partimos para programas assim. Muito obrigado, Camilo, até aqui. Daqui a pouco voltamos com as nossas interações, as perguntas e respostas. Ellen, passo a palavra para você. Estamos muito ansiosos para ouvir também a sua experiência.
Thank you very much, Marcelo, and thank you, Camilo, Giuseppe, for teeing this up. I want to thank also Camille, Fernanda, Marcelo, once again for organizing this important event and for this prestigious invitation. It's really an honor for me to be with you all today, and also to be virtually in such a special member country of the IDB, such as Brazil. I really, really feel quite grateful and quite honored. I really just want to compliment what has been discussed already about the opt-out model and comparing it with other systems by giving an example of the IDB mediation system. And as Camilo had mentioned, this is a system that is also mirrored in other international organizations. We at the IDB have both a fully voluntary side of mediation as well as an opt-out mediation model. And we had previous experience with a different model that was more of an obligatory process, which proved to be less effective than the process that we have today. So I just want to kind of share with you what our current system is for mediation at the IDB and discuss a little bit about how these models have worked for us in terms of dealing with our own employment and labor disputes. So allow me to share my screen. Please let me know when you can see my slide.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, great, thank you. So this little system of circles that you're viewing right now is presenting an overview of the IDB's entire system, and we have an integrated system of conflict resolution and ethics. And as you can see at the IDB, we have multiple instances for problem solving and resolution of grievances, ranging from the lowest level where employees can seek resolution of problems with their immediate supervisors, ranging all the way to our judicial instance, which is our IDB Administrative Tribunal. This is the highest instance that is available for the resolution of employment-related grievances. Essentially, this is our internal court, and it's made up of judges from our member countries, and they essentially provide litigation of our labor disputes. As many of you on this call know, the IDB, like the World Bank and the United Nations, is an international organization, so our employees are protected by privileges and immunities. So we have had to establish an internal system of justice that is very robust and essentially needs to replace the redress that employees generally would need to seek from local courts. Or equal opportunity commissions, say in the United States, where you normally would have an employment-related dispute. So we have established quite a robust and rigorous system, and there are many rights and duties on the part of both employees and the administration, and that includes rights and duties related to mediation. This is a system that we put in place after a series of extensive reforms at the IDB that took place in 2012. Now, you'll see in this rubric that we have both formal and informal mechanisms. Informal mechanisms such as working out disputes through an ombudsperson. And mediation is unique in the sense that it can be both informal, and in that sense, strictly voluntary, or formal or grievance related, which is our opt-out model, which is a required step that you attend one session prior to receiving any clearance to go further into litigation with our administrative tribunal. I think, as what has been mentioned so far, our number of cases in the voluntary mediation is lower than in the instance of the formal or the grievance mediation, where at least one session of mediation is required. And I'll share with you also what the outcomes and the results of that model have been at the IDB. Moving to this next slide here presents kind of both sides of the house there that I had spoken about, both the informal and the formal processes. Now, on the informal side, we have again, our ombudsperson, and then we have mediation, where people can ask for a voluntary mediation if they're in any type of a workplace dispute with a supervisor or with a colleague. But our number of cases where people are voluntarily entering into mediation in a proactive way is lower than in the other side of our house, which is the grievance or the instances where either the internal grievance system has been exhausted or the informal processes have not brought about the desired outcomes or results. So reflecting here what the process is, if there is a case, an employee disputes a decision that has been made with respect to their employment, you can appeal through our internal grievance process. You appeal to your supervisor, to your direct manager, then to the head of our human resources function. And at that point, you can request a formal mediation. And again, if it is a matter that is suited for mediation, it is required that the parties, both the employee and the administration, attend one session of mediation. So at that point, the parties and their lawyers, if they're represented by counsel, select a third party, an external mediator, and they are required to at least sit down, have one mediation session. Then the parties can themselves decide whether or not to continue. Normally, from the first session, the mediation should be concluded within 45 days. And at that point, if the parties have not reached agreement, they are able to receive a certificate of conclusion, which they can then present to our administrative tribunal or our litigation body. The mediation concludes otherwise when the parties have reached agreement, or they do receive the certificate of conclusion that they may then take on to downstream litigation. Now, some of the benefits of the program are clearly we're still working in a settlement and mediation mindset. The proceedings of the mediation are all confidential. While lawyers can take part, there are no filings, there are no documents produced, there are no briefings, there is no record created. And if the employee does go on to litigate at our administrative tribunal, nothing that has been discussed in the confidential mediation process can be entered into evidence at our labor tribunal. So it presents this open space, this third way of resolving and settling issues before resorting to litigation. Let me jump forward to showing you what the results of this system have been at the IDB. This slide presents the results of our reformed mediation process. And as you can see, since this system was put in place back in 2013, we have had an impressive rate of settlements using this model. And again, as I mentioned, the volume of our cases in the formal system is higher than in the informal system. But this slide presents our overall settlement rates. And as you can see, the average of our settlement rates has been 75% since the establishment of the office. If you look at our most recent statistic, 81% of the cases that came through the system were settled through an agreement without needing to proceed to litigation. I'll touch a little bit just about why we established the system at the IDB and how we think it has been a positive development. Because previously to having this system and previously to establishing even the option of mediating employment disputes, we did have a system that was seen much more as it was a mandatory system. It was also a required step before resorting to litigation, but it was a legalistic conciliation process where the parties needed to go through another formal step. However, it was highly legalistic. It was evidence-based. There were briefs, there were documents that were created. It was something of a preparation of essentially preparing your case and preparing your file for the downstream stage or step of litigation. So very few cases were solved at that stage. The rate of settlements was very low, and it was seen as simply a formality before you proceeded to litigation. Since we've made these reforms, I'll show you also, not only our rate of settlements have been high, but the outcomes have been positive, and the evaluations have shown that the process is both valued and considered effective by the users. And this is both the employees who are seeking redress of employment disputes, as well as the administration. So these are some of the rates from 2020 of our user satisfaction. As you can see here, 100% of those who used the system in 2020 indicated that they were satisfied with the process, that it provided them with a valuable additional tool for resolving or settling matters without resorting to litigation. 85% indicated they were satisfied with the result, with the outcome of their mediation case. And strikingly, 100% of the users did indicate that they would use mediation again if they had another claim or another dispute, and that they would recommend it to others as well. So we see this as a strong vote of confidence for why it is important to have a functioning mediation program, and why offering this model and requiring, at least when you have a claim or a dispute, that you at least give mediation a try, has been a very positive development, and has led to very positive both satisfaction and outcomes at the IDB. So a bit to mirror what Camilo had mentioned is, what do I think has been essential to the functioning of this model? I think it's very important to echo some of the messaging that he raised and some of the key success factors to having an effective opt-out model. The first is that I can say at the IDB, the reason that we put this system into place is that there needed to be, well, there were and there still are existing strong incentives for both employees and the administration to avoid litigation, to avoid the uncertain outcomes of litigation, and particularly, and very importantly, the investment of time and money and the emotional toil of being in a labor dispute and going through the litigation process in order to resolve a labor claim. So these strong incentives to avoid litigation has really translated to a commitment of the parties to the mediation process. So it is not seen as a formality, it is not seen as a check the box, it is a legitimate, credible process in which both parties really do have a good faith, make strong efforts, and are committed to reaching resolution in mediation. Obviously, in order for it to be a functioning system, you also need, as Camilo mentioned, highly competent mediators, skilled mediators. And in our opt-out model, we use only professional mediators, and these are mediators who are external to the organization. So while the program is managed and administered internally, in the formal process, the mediators are external, which additionally gives parties the comfort that it is truly an independent and a fair and a balanced process. So I think that brings me to one of the other important critical factors is, in order for your system to work, and if you're going to build trust and confidence in an opt-out model, as Giuseppe mentioned, the water needs to be good, right? The mediators need to be good. The quality of the process needs to be good. But the mediation also as a system needs to be seen as a balanced and a fair and a transparent process that has a track record of getting people results. People do need to believe in mediation, to invest their best efforts into it. And you have to build that positive reputation built on the outcomes. You need to show that it works. People have to have this confidence, both on the administration side and on the employee side, in the IDB's case, that you can do just as well or better through participating in mediation than by not, and by taking your chance at litigation at a higher cost, and that mediation can get you better results at a lower cost and faster without going through the pain of litigation. The last point I would make about this was another point that Camilo had mentioned, which is having a strong administration structure around your process. Really having a quality of the administration. Again, we have a secretariat at the IDB, we have policies, we can guide and support the process. The mediations themselves are still independent, they're carried out independent of the administration, but there is a strong scaffolding to support the process and that can move and advocate towards settlements and towards solutions. So I believe that the stewardship and the efficient management of the process is truly critical. So I will echo that point made earlier by my colleague. Just sharing a couple of comments made by users of the mediation system at the IDB, which you can read here. But essentially, over time, since this system has been established, it has proven to be a very, very valuable additional tool in our toolkit for resolving issues internally at the IDB without resolving or resorting to litigation. So I will stop there. I know that we have carved time for questions and comments. I'm obviously open to any feedback, and again, want to thank you all for your interest and for this opportunity.
Muito obrigado, Ellen, por nos, inclusive, ficar atentos a como é importante fazer as pesquisas e avaliações da experiência dos usuários, das pessoas que passam pela mediação, exatamente para que a gente possa fortalecer a percepção de que o que foi oferecido valeu a pena. Eu vou aproveitar que acabamos de ouvir a Ellen e endereçar uma pergunta que foi feita a você, Ellen, em relação ao que você nos trouxe. André Machado traz o seguinte ponto. Hi, Ellen. Mediation at IDB are only applicable to employment disputes or also to the financing agreements?
I think I did get the question. I'll reiterate, the question was if mediation was only for employment disputes or also for the projects and the financing agreements. So it's a great question. And we have two different sides of mediation at the IDB. There is the labor side, and then we also have the project side. So when this is a process that is run by our independent consultative and investigative mechanism, an entity at the IDB called the MISI. So if any of our constituents believes that the IDB is not following their own policies or implementing their projects properly, they have a consultative mechanism that they can also invoke, and they can request mediation, which is sort of the project or the financing side mediation. I'm happy to provide follow-up offline or more information about that process for anyone who is interested, but that is administered by our independent consultative and investigative mechanism. I think the acronym in Portuguese is MISI.
Muito obrigado, Ellen. Giuseppe, temos aqui uma observação junto com uma pergunta da Doroteia Mota, que diz o seguinte, e aí eu quero encaixar aqui um comentário para que a gente possa conversar juntos sobre esse aspecto. Here in Brazil, she says, our Code of Civil Procedure foresees a first conciliation step, which is an initial hearing from when parties will try to settle. Can this be considered an opt-out model? This is in the judicial environment. E eu quero aproveitar para pedir para que você comente também o resultado que nós podemos ver quando a mediação se torna obrigatória, mandatória. Temos um alto nível de casos com também alta qualidade ou existe uma relação diferente quando o modelo é totalmente obrigatório?
Marcelo, I am afraid you are overestimating my Portuguese. No, I'm joking. I think I got the
Giuseppe.
Oh, thank you, thank you, Camilo. Am I okay now?
It's okay.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Okay. I was saying, Marcelo, maybe you are overestimating my understanding of the Portuguese, but no, I think I got the question. I have learned about the Brazilian model, and I have no problem with what you have. The question is this working for you? Is this enough? if this works, whatever the name, there's no question, no issue whatsoever. It's not the model. What I think is not there in Brazil, you might want to have, given hundreds of millions of civil disputes, is the idea that if you want the justice system, the public justice system, to be more efficient, you maybe want to help that public justice system by making at least some mediation happen outside of the justice system and before the justice system is engaged. That has been the rationale in all the countries. And I saw somebody asking a question. Italy is a country, Greece is a country, Turkey, Azerbaijan has this model, which follows the Italian model. I know that in Serbia, there is a proposal. So there are many countries which are saying, we do have judicial mediation or judicial conciliation, but by the time you go to court, you already have spent money. You have already become a little bit adversarial maybe, and you are taking the court's time. So why don't we do that outside? So in principle, I would not see a problem having what we describe as a pre-trial, that is before litigation opt-out model. And for the cases that reach the court stage, the judges could do that. But again, it's not important what the model is important what results are being produced. If you are happy with the Brazilian model, that's fine. I mean, if you have tens of thousands of judicial mediators, for example, that could work. You know, you file a case, and before you can go on, a good mediator is provided to you, and he or she can see if the case can be settled. So again, more important is if you have a problem, what are the best solutions, and what is at the heart of the easy opt-out model is to try to make some, not all, cases settled before and outside the court system. So more mediations, now is lots of cases in court, right? Court, and very few mediated now outside of court. The idea is to rebalance that. I hope I answered the question.
É uma parte da resposta, com certeza nós temos um ponto fundamental no Brasil, que é a experiência depois da lei do aumento de mediações dentro dos tribunais.
Thank you, Dorothea.
As preocupações que vêm junto, que estão ligadas à qualidade, capacidade de atendimento. O que, por um lado, ajuda muito o judiciário. Por outro lado, nos preocupa porque, quando a qualidade de realização das mediações é baixa, a imagem da mediação também fica comprometida, fora dos tribunais. Portanto, realmente, esse balanço pode ser feito começando a pensar num modelo que ajude antes as pessoas utilizarem a mediação antes de terem que chegar até as portas de uma corte.
Marcelo, can I say something if you finish about the question? Because the question that Dorothea asked is very important. Do I have a moment to say something, or
Please.
Can I? Okay. I think that it's very important to focus on this aspect, because in every country where certain requirements, initial reasonable efforts are asked, the ones who oppose mediation say something like this. At least that was the case in Europe. Mediation makes no sense, because if the two lawyers have not been able to resolve that, right, we need a judge. I think that one of the rationale, so mediation has really no place, because either the case can be solved amicably and the lawyer should be able to do it, or there is no need of something amicable. Then it's an authority figure that either makes a decision, or, as in the case of judicial mediation, because the mediation takes place inside the trial process, you know, the idea is that the parties will have to behave more seriously or will kind of follow the direction, the suggestion of the conciliator. So the idea is that mediation really has little meaning. That was an argument that was made. And when people say that, I ask everybody to focus on what I call the desert roses. The roses in the desert, those flowers that we don't know how they can bloom and blossom because it's torrid, there is no water, but they are there. And those are the mediated cases that settle when mediation is mandatory. Let's pause for a moment. We saw that in certain countries, Italy being one, when people are forced to mediate, but even at the World Bank, even at BID, right? Even when they're forced to mediate, when they're forced to mediate, they are likely, or at least 50% of the cases, to settle the dispute. Think about what would happen without the requirement to try. Those cases will not have settled, because if and when mediation takes place, is only for one or two reasons. The parties did not try to mediate at all. They went directly to the judge, or they tried and failed. Because keep in mind also, this is very crucial. When we have mandatory mediation, it does not mean that people cannot negotiate, or they can go to a private mediator, right? If I have a problem with Eduardo, regardless, independent of what the Brazilian law might say, Eduardo and I can negotiate, or Eduardo and I can go to Marcelo as a friend, not as a mediator, and say, can you help us out, right? So the reason why people settle cases in mandatory mediation is because all this didn't happen or didn't work out. So it was only the requirement that generated that. Think about those hundreds of thousands of cases in Italy they settled. Why did they settle? Because people were obliged to mediate. Sometimes those cases are not even resolved through mediation. They are resolved otherwise. I know that I have to mediate with Eduardo because otherwise I will not be able to appear before an Italian judge, because the law says that I need to prove, right, that I tried to mediate. But I can call Eduardo and say, you know, I really don't want to talk to you because you're a bad guy. But since we have to do and pay for this mediation thing anyway, why don't you and I talk? We're going to save the money of mediation if we can settle. So we do have the evidence that when mediation is required, there is a lot of pre-mediation activity. So when you have a report on the cases that mediated before trial, which are a lot, you do not have the cases that are solved not in mediation, but because of mediation. Since I have to do mediation and pay for it, I might as well settle without paying for mediation. Do you follow the rationale? So there is a lot of consequences of having a framework that requires party smartly to make effort to resolve the case. I really want to focus on those days of roses. You know, those cases will not settle because people were ready to sue, to go to court. And the only reason why they settle is because the law required them to make that effort. So it's not, when lawyers say those cases would have settled anyways. It's not true, because they filed the mediation request the day before going to court. They had all the time before filing the case to settle, and they didn't try or did not succeed. So let's really focus on what is very powerful here, which is the consequences of leading the horse to the water when the water is good. I'm sorry, but I really wanted to focus because I've heard lawyers all over the world coming up with this argument. What is the value added of the mediator? And those cases settled because they could settle. You know, they were mediatable, were easy to mediate. No, because they didn't settle at the beginning. They settle at the very end, right before going to court. So that is why those cases settled, in my opinion. Over to you, Marcelo. I'm sorry for preaching about it, but I'm very passionate about wrong arguments and good arguments.
No, very important. Fernanda, Camilo e Eduardo, fiquem à vontade para colocarem algum ponto.
Marcelo, eu vou pegar uma das perguntas aqui que foram colocadas pelos participantes relacionadas a Ellen, falando sobre... Aqui, peraí, colocar o meu português aqui, que eu estou com a tradução ao mesmo tempo. Falando sobre as questões trabalhistas, né? Ou seja, que tipo de questões que são levadas à mediação dentro do ambiente trabalhista, e pensando no ambiente trabalhista como um todo, se tem alguma característica especial relacionada a esse tema, relacionado a esse tema.
Thank you for the question. The most common types of things that we see in our mediation program are issues related to non-renewal of contracts or termination of employment contracts, benefits issues, administration of benefits, performance disputes, when someone is not in agreement with their performance evaluation, sometimes issues of respect in the workplace, issues of bullying or harassment. So those are the top issues, and they seem to be equity issues as well, disparate treatment, where people feel that there is something that is being afforded to one group or one person and not to another. To get to the second part of the question, is there something unique about the labor environment that lends itself to the effectiveness of mediation? I would argue no. You know, I am a strong proponent that it is a very valuable tool for any types of disputes, whether commercial, familial, or workplace. But we do have a track record in the labor side and also on the project side of a very high rate of agreements using these models. I think that the factors that we laid out are important in whatever type of mediation you're talking about, which is, again, incentives to use the program, meaning your options are not going to compare as favorably, and then the commitment of the parties and the quality of the services. And I'll take 2 minutes maybe to just piggyback on or complement what Giuseppe said, and to respond to another question that was in the chat, which is, you know, how do you maintain a high reputation of mediation services? You know, how do you keep the reputation of mediation high? This goes to Giuseppe's point. You need to show the results. And in order to show the results, you need to get people to use it. So it is a virtuous circle. And this is, again, where we're advocating, make people give it at least one try. And then you'll create this virtual circle that they will see that it has positive outcomes. And they will see that they can do just as well or better through a mediated process than through litigation at a lower cost and faster. And that's how you build a reputation, is you really show that it works, that it is a rigorous and a serious process, and then it can get positive outcomes. So again, this lends itself to this idea of give it a shot, make people at least try it. And you'll see that it works, and we'll start that virtuous circle of then building trust and reputation of the system. And that will create even more demand, and that will start this, you know, again, this cycle. So I'll pause there.
If I may add to what Ellen just said, based on my experience also 10 years with a labor mediation program, the reason why I introduced and was able to introduce the opt-out model was because before it was 100% voluntary. It was the opt-in model. And about 10% of the people that being requested were saying no to mediation. And this was very interesting because most of the time, 90% of the time, the second party, the people who was being requested mediation, was a supervisor. Okay, it was a superior of the first party that was requesting it. And human resources and the staff association sat down and they said, why is this happening? Why is this going on? As a supervisor, you are expected to communicate with your supervisee, with the people that work for you. Why are you saying no to mediation? And they thought that that didn't make sense from the point of view of the organization. So they decided to agree to the opt-in model. Now, how we did have resistance from supervisors when they were invited into mediation. And they were saying, well, why do I have to meet with this person? Why is it that, you know, the person is not performing? This is terrible and so on. And we always, you know, this was the quality of the intake I was talking about earlier. This happened during the intake for the second party that was being asked. And our argument was always, you know, this is not just for the supervisee. This is not just for the employee. This is also an opportunity for you to have a very deep conversation with your employee about what is going on, and to tell this person things that before you were not able to tell them, very frankly, about their attitude, maybe, about the things that they were doing in the workplace, etc. So this conversation that I had hundreds of them with supervisors, at the end of those 30 or 45 minutes that took the intake, they were convinced that they were getting something out of it. And they actually got something out of it. And it reflects in the level of satisfaction that they got at the end. But in many places, especially I was talking earlier about high power distance cultures, supervisors feel in some ways that they have been violated by the fact that they have to sit down in a mediation with an employee, that somehow these attempts against their own dignity, whatever it is, which, you know, it reflects this kind of high power distance. But the reality is supervisors also need to have these frank conversations. Many times they have emotions about what is going on. They're angry about what is happening. They feel betrayed and so on. And the mediation is an opportunity to actually have those conversations. So that resistance that we experienced in 10% of the cases that was coming mostly from supervisors, from bosses, we were managed to handle it during the intake process, you know, because you should expect it.
Interessante. Estamos caminhando para o final, sem dúvida, tem muitos assuntos para a gente falar e muitas perguntas que estão sendo colocadas aqui, mas estamos reunindo todas, exatamente porque esse é o começo de uma série de conversas sobre o tema. Nosso objetivo, né, Eduardo, é que a gente possa efetivamente colocar na pauta, na agenda das conversas no Brasil sobre quais são os modelos que trazem esse tipo de resultado que o Camilo acabou de trazer para nós aqui, acabou de comentar, uma experiência específica muito clara, Ellen também com dados e informações fundamentais. E um ponto, Giuseppe, que foi colocado aqui, uma das perguntas e observações que foram feitas, se eu não me engano, pelo Fábio, além do método da saída facilitada, que é bem eficiente para se divulgar a mediação, quais as outras formas eficientes que a Itália e a Europa têm usado para fazer a mediação ser mais conhecida? Aqui um ponto fundamental, Fábio, e eu comento isso em função dos muitos trabalhos, por exemplo, que o Giuseppe fez para o Parlamento Europeu em termos de consultoria, para produzir relatórios que avaliavam o impacto da Diretiva 52 desde 2008. E, efetivamente, é importante, e esse evento serve muito para isso. Divulgar a mediação, sensibilizar as pessoas é fundamental. Porém, não é isso que mudou a realidade nestes países. Os relatórios são muito claros. Eu acho que o Giuseppe, mais do que ninguém, que pesquisou, conversou com especialistas de toda a Europa e fez essa pesquisa diretamente deles. O que efetivamente muda uma realidade para as pessoas começarem a utilizar mais a mediação É uma medida legislativa que faz essa espécie de incentivo, um pouco como um empurrão, um nudge, para que as pessoas experimentem a mediação. Efetivamente, a partir daí, a mediação passa a ser algo que entra no radar, na possibilidade concreta de ser utilizada em uma nação. E mais para frente, como talvez hoje seja a realidade do Banco Mundial, seja a realidade do BID, como os Camilo e Ellen trazem, a pergunta não é mais por que a mediação? A pergunta passa a ser por que não a mediação? Se ela é mais rápida, economiza os recursos, preserva os relacionamentos e mantém o controle sobre o resultado. Então, eu acredito, Giuseppe, que ainda existe essa ideia de que devemos divulgar mais a mediação, sem dúvida. O ponto é, as medidas que estão sendo debatidas aqui é como fazer com que as pessoas utilizem a mediação, e não como podemos divulgar mais, e sim como elas podem utilizar mais a mediação. E aproveito para fazer essa ponte nos aspectos finais, conversarmos essa semana, Camilo, Ellen, Giuseppe, todos aqui, sobre como, e aqui eu sei que tem muitos magistrados acompanhando e pessoas que vão ajudar a pensar esses modelos, como que quando nós criamos um filtro efetivo de litigância antes das pessoas utilizarem os tribunais, aumenta inclusive a eficácia dos próprios tribunais, que passam a funcionar de uma maneira mais leve, com mais foco, uma resposta maior para a sociedade. Então, todos estão ganhando nessa situação. Não existe uma situação de puxar o nosso ponto para um lado para o outro. Todos, numa visão sistêmica, acabam ganhando. Giuseppe.
Well, thank you. There will be so much to say, but I have already taken so much time. So I think I'll try to, I might be sounding like a priest at the end of the service, but I'd like us to leave this, the people who have been so patient to listen to us with some basic facts. There is something happening in certain countries, we mentioned them, at the World Bank, at the Inter-American Development, but also at the United Nations, which is common, which is the same. And it's very simple. If you ask, what should we do? Now, we need to promote mediation. How? It's very simple. There's one common thing. You have to have a system that requires people to make that effort. And has to be a reasonable effort. Shouldn't be too much, shouldn't be too little. What all these systems have in place is mediation cannot be fully voluntary. Nudging means leading the horse to water, because we as human beings do not do the right thing always. And especially when it comes to decisions that have to do with uncertain events. Will I win the case or will I lose the case? Will I win $1 million or 100,000 reais? We are especially bad at making those decisions. If we have a third party, that person can help. So this is about policy. Policy is making people do the better thing with the least amount of efforts. If the Brazilian government has a lot of money to spend, there would be no problem to make mediation mandatory before people can go to court. Brazil would have to pay good mediators, make them available for free, right? With the taxation, they would pay the mediators, and those mediators would be necessary to go to, right? You guys would have to do it. And a lot of cases would be settled there. And I'm sure you would have the same satisfaction rate that Ellen was speaking about. But that's difficult. No government has the money to do that. Now, if you want to create the mediation industry, you need to bring the demand toward that industry. Most mediators in Italy, for example, are private practitioners. They are not subsidized by the government. The reason why they decided to invest in mediation is because they know that litigants will have to go to them. So here's the point. What do you have to do? Lobby your government, lobby the legislator, tell them to look at what other governments are doing and look at the example of the international organizations. These international organizations, United Nations, World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, are funded by governments, including Brazil. So how come international organizations funded also by Brazil follow certain practices when it comes to dispute, and the common element is opt out, and you don't? It doesn't make much sense to me, unless there is a good reason for Brazil not to have the same model. But remind them, that's my suggestion to you, remind them what is working and what is not working, right? And by the time your legislator will consider better examples and examples set by international organizations, I believe your job will be much easier. So all of you who have passion for mediation, who have invested money to become mediators, will have work to do and will have to contribute to the common cause. I want to say one final thing if you find resistance, because I've been fighting for changing legislation all my life. To prevent people, government, legislators from being scared, do not hesitate to tell them what we told them many years ago in my country. We said, okay, you're not sure that mediation will work. Let's give it a try. The initial law only lasted for 4 years. So it was not forever. It was not a casamento, sin divorcio. It was just a try. At the end of those 4 years, the results were positive and the law was confirmed. I can tell you something that you think is crazy, but it speaks about the resistance to get into mediation. As we speak, a few days ago, there is a proposal by the Italian government to expand the scope of mediation. Remember, I told you it only applies to 12–15%. You know, now there is the idea to make it bigger. Even though in Italy mediation has proven its case, it has produced the results you saw, the government said, let's do it for 5 years and see. You see, there is still much resistance to that. If that's the bad news, I'm going to finish with the good news. A few days ago, I was following a seminar online, and there is a movement now to see that to reinterpret the Constitution, the fundamental laws of our states, in a sense, that not just to make them allow mediation, to make mediation possible, right? Remember that court judgment I wrote you. You can do mediation provided those 4 requirements are met. Not too long, not too expensive, suspended time limits, and so on and so forth. Remember those 4. That seems to be the Constitution allows you to do mediation. There is now an attempt to read the Constitution as requiring mediation. When the Constitution speaks about us, not just me, collective right as opposed to individual rights. When the Constitution speaks about the fulfillment of individuals and improving society's life, you know, there is an attempt to see mediation, and even mandatory mediation should not just be tolerated, should be the way to go. It may be a bit too much, right, too soon, but you have a very clear and simple solution with lots of examples in Brazil by looking at our international organizations, your international organizations, because Brazil is one of them as a member, and what's happening in other member states. That is my final advice. Please don't let me come in with Ellen and Camilo in 2028. I first came in 2013. It's not in another 10 years to tell you, we told you what to do. We told you in 2013, we told you now. That is the one message to bring forward. And don't be concerned about quality. The practice of mediation will generate quality. So and lots of you are qualified, are trained, are specialists, but you just don't get enough practice. Practice will make you better. So it's a vicious circle. Unless the law starts generating the practice, people will always be hesitant because they will not have good example. And as a priest, I say amen without being disrespectful. It's just a joke. But I really believe that it's very simple what to do, which is really to go, the service is over, and focusing on the one achievable, simple target that the worldwide experience suggests is the way forward. Thank you all. I thank you, Marcelo.
Muito obrigado, Giuseppe. Muito obrigado. Antes de passar a palavra para o Eduardo para fazer, né, o fechamento, eu vou passar a palavra para a Ellen e depois para o Camilo para fazer as suas considerações finais, já agradecendo aqui da minha parte, de coração, pela disponibilidade, pela contribuição dessa troca de experiências que, sem dúvida, fará muita diferença aqui no nosso país. Ellen, please, or Camilo.
Well, I just wanted to thank for the opportunity to talk about this very important subject and just think about the impact that having a law that actually implements mediation in the way that it works better will have for the hundreds of millions of people in Brazil, and the example that this can give to other Latin American countries that I don't think have the same, have an opt-in more clearly established. So I will encourage you to actually fight hard to show the evidence that this is a model that works better in mediation.
Thank you very much. Very, very briefly, I think that Giuseppe and Camilo have put it perfectly, so I don't have much to add. Just to thank, again, the organizers for this really valuable event, and to my fellow panelists, it was a pleasure and a privilege. Again, Giuseppe, Camilo, you put it perfectly. I think that moving in this direction, you know, trying to encourage this is the way to go. We want to try to make this the normal, the mainstream model. In order for that to happen, you need both this kind of push and the pull, right? The pull, again, will be the utility and the quality of mediation services. And as Giuseppe mentioned, the practice will lead to those results. But you need the push, okay? You have to get the horse to the water, right? So it's like the tides, right? The push and the pull. But I really encourage you, you know, in this work to try to get to that ocean. Come on in. As you can see from the IDB, the water's fine. You know, this model has provided fantastic results for our constituencies, for our member governments. If there's anything that I can do to help you in this journey, please count on me. I'm happy for this introduction and look forward to continued collaboration.
Muito obrigado, Ellen. Muito obrigado, Camilo. Muito obrigado, Giuseppe. Obrigado aos nossos tradutores. Eu fecho minha participação aqui e passo a palavra para o Eduardo.
Opa, Marcelo. Antes de fazer os nossos avisos aqui finais, próximos passos e etc., eu vou passar a palavra, então, para a Fernanda e depois para a Camila e também fazerem suas considerações finais.
Obrigada, Eduardo. Só gratidão, né, pela essa partilha, pela generosidade, pelo tempo de vocês. E, enfim, nós estamos continuando nossa jornada, né? Eu acho que é isso, em conjunto, com muitas partilhas, com muitos projetos, e esse caminho é um caminho muito rico, necessário para o nosso desenvolvimento, né? Desenvolvimento enquanto pessoas, enquanto sistema, enquanto economia. Então, só agradecer a todos aqui pela partilha, a todos que nos acompanharam essa manhã e que venham os próximos. Muito obrigada.
Maravilha. E ecoo a tudo que foi falado hoje, realmente um marco muito importante para o nosso país, a gente poder ter o privilégio de aprender com aqueles que fizeram funcionar e ver como é possível e como tem caminhos para que realmente algo que todos sabem quando participam, né? Unânime, por exemplo, no BID, pelo 100% de respostas, todos sabem que quando participam de uma oportunidade de poder resolver pela autocomposição, é benéfico, é positivo. Então, trazermos isso para uma realidade fática, como o Marcelo falou e todos, estamos há muitos anos e há muito tempo trazendo essa realidade em termos de aprimoramento cultural, agora falta o push, falta um ponto. E é interessante quando a gente pensa, será que a nossa cultura é humano, né? Da gente ver vários países, né? Então, não é uma questão o Brasil, não é uma questão o país Y ou o país Z, mas sim uma questão humana, e todos vocês viram, junto com a chamada do evento, um texto trazido pelo Giuseppe, onde ele traz, né, os prêmios Nobel do comportamento humano, que falam sobre a forma, de uma maneira científica, como o ser humano toma as suas decisões abaixo do ótimo, muitas vezes, né? Então, na verdade, quando essa policy, como eles trazem, né, de uma saída facilitada, ou seja, uma mediação que tem um primeiro esforço inicial, essa frase para mim ressoa muito, um primeiro esforço inicial para que a gente consiga aí fazer a mudança que todos queremos e visualizamos enquanto benéfica, né, para a advocacia, para a sociedade, para todos nós. Então, uma satisfação enorme estarmos dando início a essas conversas, e agradecer muito Ellen, Camilo e Giuseppe pelas partilhas e as experiências daquilo que funciona e por estarem à disposição para nos auxiliar nessa trajetória. Muito obrigada, devolvo a palavra, Eduardo, para você.
Obrigado, Camille. Então, eu começo aqui agradecendo ao Giuseppe, ao Camilo, a Ellen, por disponibilizar o tempo, que a gente sabe que é algo precioso hoje, e o encontro de agendas. Nós tivemos que reagendar o evento em função de uma agenda particular minha, em que precisava de resolver algo importante aqui dentro do nosso sistema, mas que nós conseguimos reajustar essa agenda e ter esse bate-papo aqui fantástico, fantástico. Só o que eu tenho de anotações aqui, para fazer considerações finais, daria mais um evento, tá? Para ver o quanto foi rico as experiências trazidas aqui. Bom, como desdobramento, tá? A primeira questão que eu trouxe aqui é que nós faremos, e o Marcelo já deu ali algumas pitadinhas, né? Nós iremos fazer outros eventos, outras conversas, para amadurecer o que seria uma forma, um modelo, a que nós possamos encampar aqui no Brasil. E eu falo isso com um pouquinho de experiência dentro da nossa entidade, que começou nesse assunto de forma mais recente ou não tão recente, com a nossa lei de arbitragem. A nossa instituição foi uma das grandes instituições brasileiras que apostaram nesse movimento, né, lá em meados de 93, quando começava a se falar na nossa querida Operação Arbiter, né, Fernanda? Então, isso já vem sendo uma política nossa de incentivo, quando nós tivemos lá a resolução 2010, a resolução 125 de 2010 do CNJ, que trouxe a política pública do Estado, né, de acesso à justiça, que depois veio ser melhorada um pouquinho com o nosso Código de Processo Civil, que poderia ter sido um pouquinho mais ousado, mas foi um começo, acho que foi um input também muito importante, e quem sabe, daqui com essas conversas maduras, trazendo experiências como a que nós ouvimos hoje, a gente não consiga também provocar outras mudanças legislativas ou até mesmo culturais. Eu acho que a cultural ela vai ser uma das mais importantes. A legislativa ela ajuda, mas a mudança cultural eu acho que ela é fundamental. Do nosso lado, nós estamos tentando trazer isso para dentro das empresas, falando o tempo inteiro, não judicialize. A desjudicialização é um fato importante para as empresas. Eu vi aqui várias perguntas sobre as apresentações, com autorização dos nossos palestrantes. serão disponibilizadas. Nós vamos subir em disco virtual, onde vocês poderão fazer o download dessas apresentações. O evento, como vocês viram, é um evento que está sendo gravado, também estará disponível no YouTube já na próxima semana. E aguardem que teremos novidades em breve. E eu quero finalizar, então, o nosso evento com algo que a Ellen trouxe, né? Incentivo. Eu vou trazer essa palavra aqui. Né? Quais os incentivos a gente pode trazer para que a mediação seja um instrumento praticado com maior ênfase, porque já é praticado no Brasil. Então, a minha palavra final é incentivo, e muito obrigado a todos por participarem desse evento, por acreditar que este instituto é um instituto que pode colaborar e muito com o crescimento da nossa nação. E assim finalizamos esta conferência com agradecimento aqui a todos e uma salva de palmas.